Hey, all. Thank you so much. It's great to be here and it's great to be back. I'm Bailey Bursick and I'm here with my colleague, Jeff Kasmer. And today we're going to be talking about identity governance from a security perspective, especially in the age of AI. Now, we do have a packed agenda for y'all here today. So we know that there's folks in here ranging from high schoolers all the way to seasoned professionals. So we're going to start out with a bit of a history lesson as to how we all got here. We're going to talk about some of the security challenges that we've faced as IT professionals over the years, uh, focusing on some of these security challenges, and then going into our next frontier, which is going to be some of these AI-based attacks we've been seeing, and also what you can do to defend your internal infrastructure with some of the AI tools your employees may be leveraging. We'll close out with some controls so that this will be a very practical session in terms of things that come Monday when you get back from the conference. You'll be able to send out some of these go-dos to your teammates and share this content with some of your colleagues. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff to get us started.
Thank you, Bailey. So as Bailey said, because everybody comes from different experiences, some earlier in careers, some have been doing IT security for quite some time, we're going to see some really quick kind of establish of terms here. So we're going to talk identity. Identity, right, is really who we are. And this is kind of the, how do I say, the fabric of cloud in some way, right? Identity controls, identity access really becomes important in this modern era. And then we look at resources. Resources will be things that we access, whether these are file shares, SaaS apps, on-prem apps, network resources, things that we want to do or use. And then authentication. Authent is how we verify who you are. Are you really that identity? How do we know with some assurance it really is that person? And then authorization, the auth, are you authorized? Even though we know who you are, the thing that you're accessing, should you be accessing that? And in the cloud era, really what has changed? It's a lot of the same things, but we're doing them in a slightly different way. So we get to work with customers who are really transforming. They're moving from our traditional landscape of on-premises resources and identity and security and moving to cloud-based. So we've actually looked at, and this is actually what we do with customers and seeing with customers, is these 5 states of transformation, right? So as the cloud world began, we started seeing what's called cloud attached. You may have seen the beginning, the rise of SaaS services, the Office 365, the Google workspaces, right? These were services people were consuming. And then over time, right, they started consuming more of these services. They have their traditional on-prem services, and now because they're using more, they're in a hybrid state. And then over time, as their workloads are moving away from on-premises to the cloud, they are cloud first. They're no longer buying box software, installing software. They're buying SaaS apps, or they're deploying resources, PaaS services, not your traditional software. And then there's a period where we're transforming, right? We're getting away from on-prem and we're minimizing on-premises resources. We call this AD minimized, right? AD really was a very popular identity provider in the on-prem world, but as we shifted to cloud providers, we're minimizing those dependencies. And then finally, at the end state, 100% cloud. We no longer have on-premises identity, on-premises resources. We've moved them all into a cloud-managed single spot of managing our environment. So, what are some of the security challenges in this new cloud era? Well, when I look at the kind of the modernization of how we've made this transformation, this shift, we started bringing our resources into a common control plane. Things like Entra, right? Entra is our IDP, our identity platform, but there are others out there. A consolidation allowed us to bring the resources, and we gained single sign-on. No longer do we have to live in the world where I have 5 user accounts, 5 passwords, things to remember. And I also have the ability to have a better user experience. I only have 1 credential now, or I only have 1. But now I have this central control plane for authentication. And that allowed us to do some really magical things. Now we have things we can apply to the sessions, right? We talk about password authentication, and we heard the terms MFA. And really bringing the consolidation of authentication enabled those session controls. So now, if you're using a password, you really need to be using MFA at a minimum today. But we see customers moving to phishing-resistant credentials, passwordless credentials, device identity. These are our multiple layered controls we can apply to those sessions because we manage them centrally. But one of the things is, that's the session, the authentication. What about the access? That is what attackers want. Either it's elevated access, business data access, but we want to manage that access. So we've seen the rise of tools. You might see identity governance tools who are trying to bring all that access to a single pane of glass and trying to manage it. But just like we saw the consolidation of the authentication layer, we see the consolidation of the authorization layer. So now we're able to bring that authentication, that risk signal, those controls to our access landscape. Protect the access, protect the session, secure the environment. So some of these new capabilities brought new challenges, right? SaaS applications, the rise of, I can just buy an application with my credit card. I could buy 5 applications, right? IT is no longer the only procurement of services in the organization. The rise of shadow IT. But then external collaboration. We've been doing collaboration for decades, but it was really around in our managed environments. We gave credentials, they used our credentials, but we moved to truly bring your own credentials, bring your own identity. How do we manage the data exfiltration that this allows? How do we manage the lifecycle of external identities? And then cloud infrastructure. We talk about on-premises, we move to GCP, AWS, Azure. Many organizations have moved to cloud infrastructure, but not just one, but many of them. How do we manage the access that's appropriate across them? And then work from anywhere. We are working, some of us in this room, but we're traveling, we're working while we do that. The business, every organization has moved to a work from anywhere kind of stance, but this also increases our attack surface. And that also brings the devices we manage or devices we use to access resources. We now have BYOD, unmanaged devices. And then finally, you've heard the term AI today. You're going to hear more about it because it is something to be looked at and managed, because AI will bring the ability to discover the access you have assigned to users, even if they don't realize it. I kind of call this shadow access discovery. I may not know I have access, but if I ask AI to get me data, it may surface it for me.
Thank you, Jeff. And with that, as we think about how to approach these next things that we're seeing in your security journey, I want to break it down into 3 parts. And I want to emphasize something that John Walker from Beyond Trust mentioned in a session earlier today, that a lot of this is focused on doing the basics very well. I know that AI is the sparkly new toy that everyone's talking about at the moment, but at the end of the day, it really comes back to those basics. So whether you've been in industry for several years or you're just starting out, having a solid understanding of these basics is going to be critical for you going forward, and you can apply it to any new technology that's coming out, in this case, AI. So I do want to focus on 3 things here. 1, over-permissioning as a core topic, as well as insider risk, especially from an AI lens, and then finally, AI discovery. So over-permissioning, as Jeff mentioned, as we're moving to the cloud, a lot of organizations are multi-cloud. I find it very rarely that I work with a customer that's purely Azure. They usually also have GCP, AWS, other clouds. And as we have this growth into more and more multi-cloud environments, we're seeing an explosion of identities, both human and non-human, across multiple clouds that organizations are having to manage. And we've seen the telemetry on this, that over 90% of these identities are leveraging less than 5% of the permissions granted to them, which if you're a bad actor and you get control of a user account that has these privileges, this is much more enticing because I can do many more actions in that environment that I should not be able to do. And in addition to that, what we're seeing is of those extra permissions, over 50% of them are high risk. And by high risk, I mean like your create, your update, your delete permissions, where I would be able to do damage or get information or make changes that I should not otherwise be able to do. Now, what we've seen as well is that over time, the longer identities are with an organization, which if you've been with an organization for several years or your organization is several years old, you'll see this influx of permissions that are granted to various identities. And it naturally happens. So if I stay with an organization and I move teams, or I work on multiple projects where there's turnover, I'm going to naturally accumulate more and more permissions. And we start to see this big delta in terms of permissions that are granted to an identity and permissions that are actually used by that identity. And this is challenging for a lot of orgs because it's difficult to get comprehensive visibility into this full sprawl of permissions. And again, if a bad actor gets control of it, it can be something that increases your blast radius. And the solution that a lot of orgs have taken with this is by leveraging something called a KIM solution. And it's pronounced KIM like the name. It was coined by Gartner in 2018. And typically KIM solutions contain 3 different things here in terms of similarities. So first off, they're typically for managing a hybrid or multi-cloud environment, and they're helpful for identifying anything abnormal in your environment by leveraging some cool machine learning insights or anything else that may flag a privilege as atypical or dormant or being unused. And finally, KIM offerings are generally able to bring you to a true least privilege because you're able to peek into that delta between permissions used and granted. Now, for each of these three overarching bullets that I'm going to showcase today, I do have a recommended action slide to make it easy for folks to see what should I be talking about when I get back from SANS CloudSec Next with my team. So first of all, if you're wanting to have an over-permissioning discussion, it's going to be crucial that you find the right stakeholders and get them in the room. And be aware of any sort of seasonal access. So if you work for an organization where around the holidays, that is when you have a big spike in sales, folks might be using permissions or privileges or accessing resources they don't normally access. Take that into account as you are going through and revoking permissions. Also look into if you have folks that are from incident response in the room, because if you do shine a light on all of the permissions that are in your environment, you may see something you were not expecting to see. So we recommend that you start with non-human accounts first, just because they tend to have more predictable access patterns since we're removing that human element. And you're going to want to start with identities that have access to any sort of high value resource or any sort of um, privilege that it's no longer using. So also look into for human accounts to be able to cut down on taking away or to be able to cut down on standing access. So if you are able to move to just in time or just enough, where I would elevate up into that global admin access, for example, make sure you can just strip away that standing access. So that way, again, if that account is compromised, it's less risk to your organization. And a big part of over-permissioning conversations is process, which I know is not necessarily the technical component, but that communication component that's going to be critical as you look forward of how can we make these changes in the future and ensure that we don't end up in the same state again. Now, if those slides look a little bit familiar to you and you attended last year, my colleague Mark Morzinski and I actually have a full 30-minute session that's up on the SANS YouTube channel where we go into over-permissioning in depth. So this is a short URL there for you if you would like to go watch it after this talk, where we go into more detail. But I do want to move forward with the two other bits that we have here today. From an insider risk perspective, when most folks talk about insider risk, we're thinking of these bullets that we have on the screen, which are general things that if you look at any sort of corporate training video of do's and don'ts within the workplace, of maybe don't share corporate secrets, leak outside information, do fraud, insider trading, things of that nature. These are things that we're having to look for with our end users, and we're pretty used to from an insider risk component. But what would you call something like this? That I think a lot of folks are doing today. In our keynote, we heard about how a lot of incident response summaries are now, I believe she mentioned that it was 8 hours can be saved for various incident response summary work from the CISO is Elastic, Mandy Andrus. And this is something that we see a lot of end users doing, where naturally they're wanting to leverage AI tools for productivity, which is amazing, and I'm a huge champion of. But when users are leveraging unapproved AI tools and putting confidential information into those that can be used for future trading, that's something that is also an insider risk, but is unintentional insider risk that we also need to be looking out for as we expand to having more AI tools in the workplace. And again, this isn't something that's bad. The message that I want you to take away here is that these AI tools are incredible for performing these tasks, cutting down on some of the time for repetitive tasks. However, they do need to lock down appropriately and to be looked at with a new lens. So an example of unintentional insider risk could be, as I showed a moment ago, putting confidential data into an unapproved AI solution. It could also look like sharing confidential information with folks who should not otherwise have access. So it could be groups within your organization. A lot of folks use information barriers or other tools like that to be able to prevent, for example, if you're in a financial services organization where you're advising different clients on things, and there could be a conflict of interest if there's any sort of overlap. So being able to divide that where those employees could not collaborate, or with third parties that should not have access to various forms of confidential information. We also see a lot of folks requesting access to something unnecessary, which again, isn't the same as traditional insider risk when we're thinking about somebody deciding that they want to do something nefarious within your organization, but a user innocently looking to gain access to something that they might not need. This is something that, as we'll see in a moment with AI discovery, can be quite to the organization's detriment. Now, in terms of insider risk, we do have some recommended actions here as well, from the gaining access all the way to the revoking access in terms of that user lifecycle. So first of all, take action to leverage controls to prevent users from acquiring unnecessary privileges. So make sure you have controls in place for requesting access if they are looking for a privileged role assignment or access to confidential data. Also, as they have various forms of access, make sure you're leveraging some sort of data loss protection labeling. So being able to label a file as confidential, for example, or something that's fit for public consumption. So that way it can cut down on that sharing. Also, make sure you're leveraging data isolation capabilities. An example of that is information barriers or any other form of a technology to prevent groups within your organization who should not be communicating, to restrict that collaboration and avoid conflict of interest. And finally, look into revoking that access. So if a user is not leveraging that permission, be sure to take it away. And also think about if there's any sort of additional preventative action you can take when insider risk is detected. So if the user is doing something that may be flaggable as some form of insider risk, I know in conditional access, there's some new detection capabilities there where you can put in any sort of MFA prompt or some other actions in place. I'm sure there's other technologies as well for insider risk detection, but just make sure you're looking at before that access is granted as well as after and what you can do about it. And finally, the sparkling new toy everybody wants to talk about, which is AI discovery. And AI discovery is fantastic because it's helpful for end users to be able to find resources that they have access to. So if I'm able to ask an AI assistant, show me the deck that I was working on with Jeff if I lost it, or other files or things that we've been working on together, that's really helpful. But if I'm a bad actor and I get control of an identity, this is also really great. It's way more than just asking, who am I? I can ask an AI assistant about all sorts of confidential information that I shouldn't know about, like a new product release and things of that nature. So it can get quite scary. But in addition to that, just like with insider risk, there's some examples of unintentional AI discovery. Similar to insider risk, you may have where, folks are doing something bad within your org that's an obvious HR no-no. Like I could be asking an HR, or I could be asking an AI assistant for Jeff's performance evaluation, which if I'm his peer, I should not have access to. If I'm his manager, maybe I should be able to query that information. But when we think about a user asking an AI assistant for something related to their job, like what should I be looking at this year in terms of a financial forecasting for such and such industry? And it pulls up something that on the other end of the company people are working on in terms of a merger and acquisition or some confidential product launch information, financial information. That's really not great. So some other examples of this may include healthcare data, where we're looking at PII of patients or of other employees or of customers. So again, going back to John Walker's presentation earlier today, this is about doing the basics very well and labeling these appropriately. This is not caused by something new and sparkly that we were not predicting, but it's caused by lingering or excessive access, that privileges that users should no longer have, improper DLP labeling, if something is not labeled as confidential or for a specific group to have access to and not others, and lack of data isolation. If I should not be able to communicate with this side of the company, given my job function, then I should not be able to query AI or be able to leverage an AI assistant to be able to get that same information. An example of this may look like the following, and I know that we know, since we've taken some SANS training, to likely not put a secret access key in a Word doc, but this is what end users tend to do, right? So if we look at something like this, where it might be automatically flagged as confidential, thank goodness, for a secret project called Project Obsidian. And then we might also be looking at putting these files related to Project Obsidian inside of some sort of highly confidential file labeling, because it's a brand new product release and we don't want other folks within the organization to know about it. Now, if I'm a user who is not on this project, the correct way, if this is formatted in a way that's properly done with DLP labeling, with data isolation, then if you ask an AI assistant about this secret Project Obsidian, they should not know anything about it. And this is when it's done correctly. But when it's done incorrectly, it could go, oh, what's Project Obsidian? Let me tell you all about this new confidential project that you should have no idea about. So again, AI is not something that is bad for your organization, but it's the locking down of AI that's going to be critical as we move forward with these new technologies. Now, to summarize that in terms of some recommended actions, first of all, as defenders, use AI tools yourselves to see that full sprawl of user permissions. In our keynote, that was also discussed that by leveraging AI tools, it's a really exciting time for defenders because you can truly see that full sprawl of user permissions and get that information quickly and effectively. Also, get to least privilege truly. So back to over-permissioning. If there's any sort of tool you can leverage to truly get to least privilege, do that, because locking down any sort of AI tool in your environment is going to be critical. Also, determine the correct level of access. This can be something that's complex, especially when we're looking at folks who might not want to give up access. Sometimes there's emotional ties to having a certain level of privileges. And so being able to leverage any sort of data to figure out which account holders should have access and question any sort of lingering or outdated access. If somebody is no longer with the organization, if perhaps you're no longer collaborating with an external partner, lock down and revoke that access. I do have some short URLs here to a few different docs that cover user accounts as well as privileged accounts and links to our security and operations guide, which break down some recommendations that we've seen from a security perspective are effective for these various user accounts. It is on the Microsoft Learn docs page, but those same principles can apply to your AWS, your GCP environment, any other type of identity provider or user accounts that you're dealing with. And finally, looking into maintenance. So I mentioned earlier about challenging any sort of lingering access, but also flag anything that's atypical. If you see something that looks weird, say something and take action on it.
Thanks, Bailey. So that's a little scary, right? We have this increasing surface that we have to manage. We have all these different kind of aspects. AI is a rise. And how do we actually start controlling this access? So we're going to talk here about some controls for complete access lifecycle. And you'll see what I mean by it in a second. So we get to work with organizations of all sizes, from the very small mom and pop type organization to the mega enterprises, right? But this is a pattern that we see that really transcends and applies to all of them, just at different degrees. Now, I'm going to break down this flow here and kind of look at the controls that we apply at this life cycle. Now, you may be familiar with how we apply controls at the authentication time through conditional access. I think it's a very popular feature. We can secure or add additional layers of controls as we authenticate or access resources. But now let's applying controls and using identity to manage access and the lifecycle. So it begins, right? We start our relationship with an organization, and we do this by describing that person. I mentioned identity, but how do we make these decisions on who should have access? What is their role? Who should be reviewing? Who should be reporting or approving? We do that based on metadata provided by our employment, right? Typically, this is an HR system or HR systems, and it can be a contractor management system. But what about your external collaboration? Where are you getting that metadata to describe that relationship, that role of why you're collaborating with external partners? This all comes in and provides the metadata, the role, the employment date, when it begins, when it ends. And this is the foundational to how we build deeper governance processes. Now, as we go through, we have this data, and this allows us to do things that are kind of core, and that is we want to automate. We want to have self-service when we can't automate. And we also want to have the ability to have insights to enable policy-based controls, not admin-based controls. What I mean by that is not an admin making a decision, doing an action, having policies that allow and enable and enforce those controls along the way. So we look at taking this data and we can automate the assignment of what resources. And if you remember from I began, resources are the applications, the on-premises apps, the cloud apps, the file shares. These are all things that I want to access because I know the person, I can map that to the access they should have and avoid giving access they don't have. Now we automate that assignment so day one, they get access to what we think their job is. Everybody in sales gets the sales tools. But maybe not everybody in sales should be in Project Obsidian. So now we want to enable policies of who can request additional access beyond what was automatically assigned. This allows you utilizing that core data to say who should have the ability to request, who has to approve, who has to review, and so on when it's appropriate. And then we look at privileged access. We heard today about securing privileged access. And in most cases, I think there's an assumption that means admin level access, the ability to make changes to things. but your businesses, all your businesses have some level of privileged access to business data, business functions. The person who can make a sales order, should they also be the same person who can approve the sales order? So by bringing privileged actions and defining just-in-time elevation, utilizing that core data, we now can have that segmentation using identity controls. So now we can have restrictions and have separations of duties when we need it and limit that attack surface. So standing access is the bane, right? Because now if a user is compromised or an insider who can do MFA, they can do device controls, but if they have access they shouldn't have, you want to make sure that's removed. Now, when we get access that is assigned, it should not be forever. When you are assigning access, it should expire based on a policy, and over that lifetime, you probably want to review it. Should Jeff have access to Project Obsidian, even though he went to the IT department, he's no longer in sales? There should be a period where access is not forever. And utilizing things like access reviews, automation to have somebody verify the access should be standing or allowed, we can remove that when it's no longer appropriate. And then finally, at the end of the journey, we leave, we separate. I move on to a different company. My external partner is no longer at that organization. I want to remove that identity, remove that access, and again, reduce that lingering access so it's no longer a risk for us. And we see this at every organization, right? We call it the JML, the join, move, or leave process, right? I join the org, I get access. I move, my access changes. I move from research to marketing, so forth, right? And then when I leave, I want to be able to remove all that access. Every organization does this, from the manual SOPs to writing scripts that somebody wrote 5 years ago nobody wants to touch. You want to automate this in a way that's configurable and you can manage over time. And then finally, because I talked about that consolidation of the authentication layer now to the authorization layer, I now have full visibility of the usage of entitlements, the assignment of entitlements, how it was assigned, how long it was assigned, and when it's appropriate and not appropriate, because that metadata is all there. So by bringing all this to the same common control plane, I now get the ability to manage not just the authentication, but now the access. And this is why when we talk about identity governance, it's no longer just about compliance, right? It's about security. We feel identity governance is security because you need to manage the access in your environment. And that brings us to the end, the full life cycle that we feel represents every organization. And everything has differences, but these are the commonalities that we see every organization to enable.
Thank you, Jeff. And finally, to close with some go-dos. So if you take nothing else away from the conversation that we've had with y'all today, take these key points away. So first of all, when we're talking about governance and when we're talking about what to do, especially with the rise of AI tooling in a lot of folks' environment, first of all, look at continuously monitoring and cleaning up over permissioned users. This is going to be an ongoing process, not a one and done. So make sure you get procedures in place on how you're going to attack this and think about what you're going to do going forward to cut down on those permissions. Also leverage any sort of DLP or data isolation technologies to further reduce insider risk, both intentional insider risk and unintentional insider risk. Also look at leveraging your own AI tools as defenders to be able to see the full sprawl of user access and those identities in your environment. Also make sure to review and leverage any sort of lifecycle process for employees. So as Jeff mentioned, that joiner, mover, leaver process from day one all the way to when they exit the company. And don't forget about external partners. Be sure to review their access as well. If you are no longer collaborating with a specific partner, be sure to have that access revoked. And as Jeff mentioned as well, having good identity governance is key to defending against AI discovery-based attacks. So again, circling back to the presentation that we saw earlier today, these basics are going to take you very far, especially from a governance perspective. When we think about having AI offerings in our environment, that can get a little scary as defenders. But again, it truly is the basics. And I want that to be something you take with you at the end of this conversation today. And finally, we have our full deck already online on GitHub. So I know that the SANS folks are going to do an awesome job of sending it out. But if you are somebody who is a little impatient and want to check it out right now or send it to a colleague, annotate. If you're watching this in the future on YouTube and you're wanting to have access, be sure to check out that short URL. We give you full permission to share this with folks if it's helpful. And with that, we would love to thank you all for your time today and open the floor to questions.